and welcome to J News. I'm Jenny.
I'm Susan. Tonight, we will be investigating the hidden pressures behind the perfect post and the growing concern on university campuses and across digital culture, which is how selfish culture is reshaping the way university students construct identity, experience visibility, and cope with anxiety online. What may appear to be a simple selfish or casual post is often much more than that.
In today's platform-driven world, selfie functions as a form of identity performance, where students carefully manage post, expression, style, and editing in order to present a desirable version of themselves to others. Yet, while selfie culture is often celebrated as a space of confidence, creativity, and self-expression, our research showed that there is a more troubling reality. For many students, it also produces pressure, comparison, and emotional strain. Selfie culture promises a utopia of confidence and self-expressions, but for many students, the reality is anxiety, comparison, and pressure to appear perfect.
One key theory that helps explain this is social comparison theory, which shows how people evaluate themselves against others, especially when constantly exposed to idealized and highly curated image online. As students scroll through polished selfies, filters faces, and seemingly perfect lifestyles, these comparisons can shape how they judge their own appearance, confidence, and self-worth.
At the same time, theories of identity performance help us understand that online identity is not simply expressed but carefully constructed under the gaze of an audience, where likes, comments, and visibility begin to shape how students present themselves and also how they feel about who they are. Our research also highlights how beauty filters and platform design intensifies these pressures by rewarding a narrow camera-ready ideal and tying visibility to attractiveness and constant self-branding.
This issue matters now because university students are forming their sense of self in digital spaces that promises authenticity while often demanding perfection.
Tonight, we examine the tension between the utopian promise of selfie culture and the lived reality behind it, asking whether these platforms truly offer freedom and self-expression, or whether they are quietly reshaping anxiety, self-worth, and identity in student life.
Now let's turn the camera to our reporters. Hi, Larina and Megan.
Hi, tell us how university students say about their experience on selfie culture in their lives.
Hi, we're at UTSC campus right now and we will select 6 people randomly to see how they feel about this topic.
We will gain their understanding, perspective, and opinion on selfie culture and consumption.
Let's go!
How often do you think about how you look before posting a selfie on social media? What kinds of things influence that decision?
I usually think about how I look quite a bit. I pay attention to things like my facial expression, the lighting, the angle, and whether I look confident or not in the photo.
I think about it every time before posting. It's like current social media trends, the impression I want to give others, and my own insecurities about my appearance influence this decision.
Has seeing selfies on Instagram and TikTok changed how you see yourself? Has it affected your confidence and how you measure your own beauty?
Well, I would say I think seeing so many self-files on platforms like Instagram and TikTok has definitely influenced how people see themselves. For me, seeing self-files online sometimes make me more aware of my own appearance. When everyone seems to look perfect in their photos, it can create pressure to look the same ways or present yourself in a similar style.
On social media, the version I present is much more polished. I rarely, if ever, post photos of myself without makeup, even though that represents about 90% of my actual life.
Do you feel that the version of yourself you should show on social media is different from your real-life self? In what ways is your identity shown differently?
My identity on social media may appear more confident, more put together, or more visually attractive than in everyday life. For example, I might choose pictures where I look happy, stylish, or calm. But in real life, I also experience stress, insecurity, or ordinary moments that I think I never posted before.
Do you think that certain types of appearances or looks get more attention and visibility on social media? Why do you think that happens in the current selfie culture?
Yes, I think certain appearances definitely get more attention on social media. People who fit popular beauty standards, such as clear skin, trendy fashion, or certain body type. I think it happens because people follow trends on social media. When a certain look gets a lot of likes, more people start copying it, so it becomes more popular.
Thank you for the interview. In our interviews, a few patterns emerge clearly. The first pattern is that posting a selfie is not always as casual as it may seem. Many of people we interview thought about things like the lighting, angle, the facial expression, or whether a selfie looks good enough to upload. Many of them also thought about who might see the post and what kind of impression they were giving. So even before a selfie gets posted, there is already a lot of self-checking and involved. Posting a selfie isn't just about sharing a picture, it's also about how you present yourself to others online.
A second pattern that came up with was the difference between online self and real self. Many interviewees said that the version of themselves online is more polished and more confident. One person said that she almost never posts a picture without makeup. Another person said that the social media isn't totally fake, but it is incomplete. That's a really good description of it. Awkward parts like the stress, the insecurity about life that we rarely post about.
So this really connects to General Issues article, Real Me versus Social Media Me, that tells us that edited images shape beauty ideas among young women and can impact self-esteem too.
That really was what we heard in our interviews, especially when people talk about comparing themselves to edited selfies online and feeling pressure to be a certain way. And the gap between the real self and the social media self is not just personal, it's also shaped by the beauty images that people keep seeing online.
And the third pattern was visibility. Many interviewees feel that certain appearances get more attention on social media. They talk about clear skin, symmetrical features, trendy clothes, and certain body types. What stood out was that people did not talk about it randomly. Some of them mentioned likes, comments, engagement, and even algorithms. They were already aware that some types of looks are pushed more than others.
That connects back to Sarah/Keith's article, The Platformization of Beauty on Instagram. Zlasky argues that beauty standards online are not just influenced by individual preference, but are also shaped by the platform itself through editing tools, social pressure, and visibility through likes and comments. So social media does not simply reflect beauty standards.
Social media promotes those kinds of images that fit mainstream attractiveness. This reinforces standards. Overall, our interviews show that selfies not just influence appearance, but also how students present themselves, how they compare themselves to others, and how they understand their own confidence and self-worth. So even if selfies seem small or maybe a little bit superficial, they still tell us a lot about how identity and beauty standards are being shaped in everyday students' life right now.
Looking at both our interviews and our research, our group's main point of view is that selfie culture is often presented as something empowering, creative, and confidence building. But for many university students, the reality is much more complicated, which we found that selfies are not just casual images, they are tied to identity construction, visibility, and pressure. So for us, the issue isn't simply why university students post selfie, but how current selfie culture shapes the way they see themselves and how they want to be seen online.
I agree, and that really comes through in our interviews. One of the clearest patterns was that students rarely describe posting a selfie as a spontaneous. Even when they said it was normal, they still talked about thinking carefully about angles, lighting, facial expression, editing, and how others might react. That shows that selfie is often a managed image rather than just a quick reflection of the self. In other words, the pressure begins before the post is even uploaded.
That connects really well to Barker's idea of the selfie as a personal and social identity marker. Barker helps us understand that Selfies are not only about taking a picture of yourself, but about communicating identity to others and making who you are socially. That matters because our interviewees were not just talking about appearance, they were also talking about how they wanted to be perceived. So one student chose a pose, expression. This example works well because it shows how a selfie can seem casual while still being carefully constructed to communicate a certain version of the self.
And I think Wen and Barber help deepen that point. In selfies as expressively authentic identity performance, they argue that selfies can still feel authentic even when they're selected, edited, and performed for different audiences. They found that authenticity is often understood subjectively, and that a person can still see an edited selfie as a real expression of how they want to be seen. That is important for our topic because it shows that the tension between utopia and reality is not simply fake versus real. Instead, students may genuinely feel that a highly managed selfie is still an authentic version of themselves, even while it is shaped by pressure and audience expectations.
I want to build on that because our interviews also show that audience react matter a lot. Several responses suggest that students think about whether a selfie will get attention, others will judge it and whether it reflects them well enough. When and the Bubber discuss this through the ideas that other people influence plays a major role in how selfies are taken and which ones are selected to be posted. They also connect this to the looking glasses self where people image how they appear to others and then shape themselves around the judgment. That helps explain why selfies culture can produce anxiety. Students are not only deciding what's looking good, they are also imaging what others will approve of. This visual support that point because it shows how audience feedback becomes part of the means of the image itself.
And that is where social comparison becomes really important. Even though Barker focuses on identity markers and Wynette and Barber focus on authenticity and performance, both readings help us see that selfies are social practices, not private ones. Once selfies are posted into a space where they can be viewed, judged, and compared, students begin measuring themselves against other people's images and against the standards that seem to get rewarded. In our interviews, this came through when students talked about confidence, beauty, and whether certain looks receive more visibility than others. So selfie culture is not just about expression, it is also about learning what kinds of identities and appearances seem more successful online.
Exactly, and that is why our group argues that selfie culture creates a gap between utopia and reality. The utopian side is that it promises that selfie allows students to express themselves, control their image, and present who they really are. But the reality is that this expression often happens under pressure. The pressure to be attractive, the pressure to appear confident, and the pressure to meet what other students want to see.
And that pressure can feel normal because it is built into everyday social media use. When students constantly scroll through published images and carefully selected selfies, self-monitoring starts to feel natural. It stood out to me in our interviews is that students seemed very aware of this pressure. Even if they did not always describe it into theoretical terms, they knew that some photos feel postable and others do not. And that already shows how identity is being negotiated through platform culture.
That is also why Barker is useful here. If selfies work as identity markers, then they do more than reflect selfhood. They participate in shaping it. Students are not only expressing who they are also learning to build identity through visibility, recognition, and social feedback. So the broader issue is that online identity becomes tied to being seen in the right way.
And Wen and Barber make that even more complex by showing that authenticity is not a fixed truth. Their article suggested that authenticity online is subjective and context dependent. which means that students may feel authentic in different ways across different platforms and audiences. I think that helps explain why the same students can feel both empowered and anxious at the same time. A selfie may feel authentic because it reflects how they want to remember themselves or how they wish to be seen, but it can still be produced through pressure, comparison, and performance. This visual matters because it shows how different selfies often still repeat similar poses, moods, and beauty codes.
So from our perspective, the problem is not that students take selfies, and it is not even that they edit them. The bigger issue is that selfies culture encourages students to tie self-worth to visibility and approval. When likes, comments, and audience responses become part of how identity is validated, confidence can become very unstable. It starts depending on whether the image is seen, approved, or organized by others.
That is why this issue matters beyond individual students. It reflects a broader media culture where identity is increasingly built in public through platforms that encourage people to perform themselves in visible and measurable ways. One important change we would suggest is stronger critical awareness around the idea that visibility is not the same as value. Students should be able to see selfies as forms of expression without feeling that every post has to prove attractiveness, confidence, or worth. This final visual helps show that students are not reacting to one single image, but to an entire culture of repeated performance, comparison, and judgment.
So the overall argument is that selfie culture does offer a promise of self-expression.
That promise is shaped by audience judgment and self-monitoring.
By identity, performance, and the need to be recognized socially.
By forms of authenticity that are real to the user but still shaped by context and pressure.
And by a media environment where visibility can start to feel like proof of value.
So the gap between utopia and reality is really the gap between freedom in theory and pressure in practice.
Tonight's broadcast has shown that selfie culture is much more than simply posting photo online. Through our research and interview findings, we saw how university students carefully thinking about appearance, audience reaction, confidence, identity, and visibility before sharing selfies on social media. However, while selfie culture is often framed as empowering, creative, and expressive, our broadcast also revealed a more complicated reality in which social comparison, beauty standards, and platform pressures can shape how students see themselves and how they believe they need to be seen by others.
In this sense, selfie culture is not just only a personal issue, but also a broader cultural and social media issue, because platforms actively influence what kind of identities and appearance are rewarded with attention and visibility. As social media continues to shape how young people understand themselves and each other, the gap between utopian promises and self-expression and the reality of pressure and anxiety becomes harder to ignore. Behind the perfect post, there is often a more complex story. Thank you for watching.
We'd like to check out more UTSC campus updates. Follow J News.
Have a good night. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.